Computer Chronicles is brought to you by the Oracle Small Business Suite, one completely integrated application that helps make it easier to run your business, including accounting, sales and service, your web presence, and more. Additional funding is provided by PC to PC, the online migration service from PC First, moving files, applications, and preferences from your old computer to your new one.
Hi, and welcome to this special edition of the Computer Chronicles. Yes, that's the Roman Colosseum behind me. We are in Rome for our annual coverage of the European Technology Roundtable and Exhibition, the ETRE Conference. It's a yearly gathering of the thought leaders in the high-tech business getting together to try to figure out the future of the technology industry in these turbulent times.
We're going to be here no matter what.
The conference was held just weeks after the September 11th terrorist attacks, at a time when the stock market was way down. So foremost on the mind of everyone here was the state of the high-tech economy. Surprisingly, there was overall optimism.
What happened on September 11th was a very tragic thing. But in terms of how it has affected our industry, actually I think it drove us to the bottom of the market a lot sooner than we would have normally, which I think is an important thing. I think before the market and entrepreneurs can have a sense that they're starting to build things back up again, they have to be confident that we've finally hit the bottom. And it's been a tough year for everybody because we've all been in a free fall trying to find where that bottom was. And I think at this point I would agree with our Secretary of Treasury, Paul O'Neill, who said the people who are buying stocks today, a year from now, are going to be happy, and the people that are selling their stocks today, a year from now, won't be happy at all.
Bill Gates appeared at ETRE via satellite from Microsoft headquarters in Redmond, Washington. Gates said he too was optimistic about the technology business over the next 2 years.
The amount of dip here is modest enough so that any company that's really planning its future and being willing to deal with the jitters of the economy, any company like that is not having to do drastic cutbacks at this stage. That is, they're able to keep their R&D intact, they're able to bring in some new young employees. Certainly the research we do, the research at the universities, none of that stuff is slowing down. I'm personally quite excited about a lot of the things that happen over the next 2 years.
Despite some optimism here at ETRE among the techies, the money guys were more gloomy.
I think the Fed and the Federal Reserve and the other central banks have once again begun to put liquidity into the system like they did in late 1999 because of the millennium crisis. That time, though, corporate spending was growing, profits appeared to be growing strongly, technology was on an upswing. This time, with the liquidity coming in because of an economic downturn, a terrorism crisis, the euro currency being released later this year, it's going to create very ugly situations. It's going to create these bear traps, kind of like bubbles in an oil slick. It's going to be messy, and when it's all over, you know, I think NASDAQ could be at 800 or 900. The Dow could be at 6,500.
In fact, Tom Calandra says investors are falling for what he calls the classic bear trap.
For some bizarre reason, investors believe that there's a reason for stocks to have risen for the past week. We've had the first bombs fall in Afghanistan. We've had the terrible things that happened earlier in September. One, there is $2 trillion of cash on the sidelines. Two, that doesn't matter. History has shown that cash that's on the sidelines in bear markets either sits on the sidelines or gets used up in these bear traps, these what I call fake-out breakout rallies. I think you're going to see a lot of fake-out breakout rallies.
While many here were focused on forecasting the future, there was also a lot of soul-searching about the past and the reasons for the dot-com crash. In general, the view here was that there was just too much of everything, too many companies chasing the same market, and too much greed.
I think at the basis level it was greed that drove it. And again, the amount of money that was available and the amount of money that was being made, it was hard not to participate. And I think there are many people that did profit from the last 3 years. Not everybody did. The people, of course, that didn't are the ones that were investing very heavily over the last year. Those are the people that got absolutely destroyed. But I think the boom in the internet phenomena went on for so long, it caused ordinary, well-schooled and people with good histories to sit there and question themselves about whether or not the fact they got it or didn't get it.
The high-tech industry became intoxicated with itself and with money. I mean, there was so much money being thrown at startups and at companies that to me it reminded me of drugs. You know how people flooded the market with drugs, and everybody was high and everybody thought the world was wonderful. And I think this was one of the few cases where the drug dealers were also inhaling their own product. And I think it's becoming a more sober industry, and where people are going back to looking at companies and what are the intrinsic values of the companies.
The overall view here at ETRE was that there was simply too much money chasing too few good ideas.
The notion that, if you put money with a venture capitalist, you're sure to make money, as soon as that becomes a widespread belief, you always get into the situation that on any deal you have so much money chasing it that the relative quality and pricing gets to be a problem.
History teaches us that companies that raise over $50 million in venture capital generally fail. And I think that ethic got carried over into the public markets, because we saw companies such as At Home and any number of dot-coms, whether it's toys, e-toys, or Webvan. I think their greatest failures are that they raised too much money, and they threw all business discipline out the window.
Often people feel like, hey, I've got $10 million in the bank, where shall I spend it? That's the wrong attitude. It just means, how long can I last? With that $10 million, how long can I last? And if a company is looking at it that way, they will manage their money more properly to survive longer.
To paraphrase, too much money corrupts absolutely. Money caused people to forget about a lot of things, whether that's the creation of their own wealth in terms of confusing equity for revenue. People thought their companies were measured by the enterprise value of the company versus how many revenues they had. The second thing is that too much money also allowed them to do things that were stupid, not using resources in a proper way. How much they spend on advertising, how much they spend on customer service, how much time they spend on planning. It takes a long time to grow a sustainable company, and we weren't creating sustainable companies over the last 2 to 3 years.
A lot of these entrepreneurs are fine when you give them $1 or $2 million, because they're thinking in terms of, well, okay, now I need to hire this many people, and that will last for a year and a half. But if you give them $10 million to start a business, or $20 million to start a business, it goes in the same 18 months, and they don't make too much more progress.
The journalists here were taking a more cynical view that what went on during the past 2 years on the NASDAQ was at best calculated and at worst immoral.
This is a weird word to use with markets, but I think there was something almost immoral going on, because the venture and investment banking communities, and then ultimately the brokerage communities as part of it, transferred all risk into the public markets for a period of 18 months to 2 years. It's not an original thought on my part, but people have mentioned that, and that to me was unconscionable. And the people who got caught up in it got caught up in a mania, just a standard issue, crazy mania.
Really what we saw in the past few years is letting the public invest in highly risky ventures. That brought so much money into the marketplace that even though it seemed like a good idea at the time, we're now paying the price, and no one is going to forget that.
There was some, I think, pretty nasty calculation going on behind the scenes toward the end, at any rate, when people surely knew that they were offloading garbage that couldn't possibly do anything well into the public markets. And people who invested in this should have had their eyes more open, but it doesn't, in my mind, excuse the sort of unfairness that was going on at the time.
Not to be a cynic, but the general partners live off management fees. We've heard that here at ETRE time and time again. I mean, Alec's view has tried to make that point. And in that way, they're no different than mutual funds. You know, mutual funds get their 12B1 fees and their management fees regardless of whether they're up or down. And guess what? 90% of mutual funds are down this year.
The silver lining in all of this is that maybe we've learned some lessons and we won't go through a crazy boom-bust cycle like this again.
The physics of business hasn't changed. And by the physics of business, I think those are the innumerable laws that just cannot be violated. You have to make profits, you have to provide great value proposition to your customer, and those things are the basic fundamental blocking and tackling of our business, which somehow we forgot. There is a new wave, there is a new way of doing things, but there are certain fundamentals that we forgot about in a very dramatic, terrible way.
Until your company that you're running is making money, then by definition, you're pursuing a hobby. Okay, so profits are the best indicator of your success, and I think clearly we got way away from that. What became indications of success is how much venture capital we could raise or whether we could take our companies public, and all that was happening in the absence of any kind of real profits.
Venture capitalists like to say that they like entrepreneurs who have failures in their resumes because you learn from failures. And I think we've got a great new crop of entrepreneurs who in their next startups are going to be much, much more conservative.
But not everyone is convinced the high-tech industry has learned its lesson.
I don't think people have learned a lesson. You know, I still think what some of these speakers said about Silicon Valley will always hold true. It's either fear or greed. So right now there's fear going on, you know, but when the liquidity comes back, everybody's going to want to rush back in. There's still the quick score out there, and that mentality is getting worse than ever. I mean, people are holding stocks right now for less time on the New York Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange than ever before.
Entrepreneurs are, by nature, optimistic types. So while much of the talk here was about the current down cycle, there was just as much interest in figuring out how to take advantage of the lows and get ready for the eventual turnaround.
This is a tremendous time to be starting up a company. This is so exciting for an entrepreneur, a true entrepreneur, because there is money available. There isn't as much money available as there may have been a year ago, but there is money available, and people are going to take jobs for less money, and real estate is going to be cheaper, and they will have no competition because there are very few companies being started right now. And so they'll go into a field that'll be wide open. In fact, many of the great companies were really started or ramped up during a time just like this.
In down times, a couple of dynamics happen which I think is really important. First of all, resources open up to start a new company. So there's a pool of both talent engineers and management that are more available than before. 2 years ago, 18 months ago, it was very difficult recruiting the best people, and you had a dilution in the management pool and the talent pool, which is just very difficult. So downtimes are a great way to pick up the great people and gather them together. The second thing that also happens is the fact that the competitors in the industry that you're participating in, the larger companies, the established companies, they're not looking at investing in new things. They're looking at trying to maintain their profitability. They're looking at trying to maintain the morale of their company. They're maintaining the stability of their customer environment. And therefore, I think new companies that get started in this time have an opportunity to gain, if you will, on the technology curve and on the next product generation curve with those companies. And so it's a great time.
The greatest entrepreneurial and investment opportunities associated to with those new innovations will occur after the bubble bursts. So obviously the bubble has burst, and so what are we left with? We are left with 500 million people who are now daily dependent on the internet. Virtually every major corporation does business over the internet. And so what we've done is we've built a foundation which I think is going to be a great foundation to build on. So I would be so bold as to say that 90% of the entrepreneurial and investment opportunities associated with the internet are still ahead of us.
But not everyone here was so positive. Not everyone was convinced there's yet another boom cycle ahead.
You'll never see the kind of excesses that we experienced over these last 2 or 3 years in our lifetime, I don't think. You know, this whole notion that the way to get rich isn't to do research, it's instead you just go off and start the nth company doing a website The whole point of the internet is that the barriers to entry are low. And because barriers to entry are low, that means that the only big winner in a technology like this, the only sure winner, is the consumer who's using that infrastructure to get more information or to have more buying power, have more choices, whether it's a corporate buying process or whether it's an individual. And so what we saw was wild.
I think that it's true that right now salary expectations have dropped. You can rent space for very little. You could start a company for not much money. But it's not at all clear to me that you can start a company, create a product, and then have other people buy it. I think that that's the real rub. In just 1 year, I think we've seen the key initials that people talk about here go from IPO to ROI, return on investment. And it's impossible to sell a technology these days unless you can really prove to the business that they're going to make their money back right away.
Some things will come back and come back in a very big way. The startup sector, in my view, will never come back to what it was. That was a one-time phenomena that, always that dance was going to end, and it did. Likewise, in telecommunications, you're never going to see the kind of capital that was thrown at that sector. That's not going to come back ever to the state that it was before.
ETRE is the opposite of Comdex. This is not a meeting to show off products, it's a meeting to pick brains. And with many of the industry's top CEOs here, all were trying to come up with a consensus on how to deal with the current slump in the tech business. One strategy is to go where the market is. Many of the executives here thought there were some technology sectors that would be hot in the coming year, especially those dealing with the security of people and data.
And it doesn't matter where you are, there is a heightened interest, whether it be in additional firewalls for the internet or in devices that help you screen things at airports, anything like that. People are going to be interested in it right now.
I think customers around the world have a heightened sense of awareness of how vulnerable their network infrastructure might be. And so Symantec, along with everyone else in this sector of the industry, is spending a lot more time talking to customers about how to assess what their vulnerabilities are and how to build a constructive plan for shoring up those vulnerabilities.
I think that another application in the United States, particularly post September 11th, is going to be video conferencing. Desktop to desktop video conferencing. We've been promised video phones since 1964. I think they're going to happen in the next 5 years. And they're going to happen because we have broadband and we've got personal computers with little cameras. And the new environment that we live in is going to make travel riskier and more expensive.
I see that video conferencing absolutely will grow heavily simply because people don't want to travel so much, A, budget-wise, and B, for some of the sort of safety implications or the physical inconvenience of spending an extra 6 hours 3 hours at the airport on either end is going to do it for you, especially if you do turnaround. So I see corporate airplane travel as also picking up because they can avoid these long waits at the airport.
One big issue the industry is worried about now is possible terrorist viruses, which could have a major disruptive effect on business. The recent NIMDA and Code Red viruses were just small examples.
Well, I think NIMDA and Code Red certainly changed the nature of how customers think about securing their infrastructure. I think there were many market analysts who would have told you before those threats that, oh, gee, the virus market is a fairly plebeian market, it may be highly penetrated, so on and so forth. People are deploying firewalls and intrusion detection technology. What we saw with NIMDA was that it was a blended attack that entered the network through an email message. It buried a worm within that client desktop and then propagated itself out to servers that were on that network or linked to other networks. And that type of blended threat has become far more difficult to deal with and far more destructive.
These viruses can not only be disruptive to business, but they are very costly.
The Code Red virus cost over $2 billion to clean up. The NIMDA virus, the results aren't in yet, but it was far more aggressive, far more pervasive, and I suspect far more expensive for companies to deal with. So new blended threats, which says Firewall alone, AV alone, intrusion detection alone won't solve the problem. It's the combination of those technologies working at different tiers of the network, the best way to approach the problem.
Because of these new blended virus attacks, antivirus software is trying to move beyond mere detection and correction to prevention.
In the main, and we know a lot about the virus detection business in our company, but in the main, it is still a reactive approach as opposed to a proactive approach. There are technologies called heuristics that allow you to anticipate, based upon prior incident, how another problem might occur and then anticipate and solve it. There is what's called behavior blocking technology that says, gee, if a file comes in that has an executable attached, that's might be suspicious. It might want to execute something that's destructive on your desktop.
But protecting against a major virus attack is just the tip of the iceberg in security technology these days. New products are also being developed to protect people, not just their data.
There's a lot of new opportunities, particularly in the biometrics area, and when it comes to, for instance, feeling secure in travel situations, getting on airplanes. I've heard of new technologies where, in essence, when you walk through a checkout line in the airport, they can take a picture of your face and compare your face to over 1 million other faces on record in the course of a second. And so I think you're going to see a lot of sophisticated biometric related security technologies being developed, a lot of great companies that will solve a lot of the problems that we clearly have concerns about right now.
Whether it's biometrics in national identity cards or ways of, surveilling the community, I think there's definitely something there. And that those technologies already exist to a great extent. Biometrics, there's some amazing biometric technologies that can be built into every laptop computer that identify faces or thumbprints. And we're going to see more and more of those.
There is also a new technology from a company called Flexix that can embed computer chips in people's clothing, making it easier to track them.
I actually think that these, the integrated circuits printed on plastic, the way Flexix does, will be very potentially valuable to this because not only for very light heads-up displays and that sort of things, but plastic is moldable, and you could actually wear a GPS device on your jacket or a communicator that was on your pants or whatever, and it would be an easy, I think those technologies may make a big impact.
There was no question but that terrorism and the events of September 11th were on the minds of everyone here at ETRE. But on the positive side, there was generally the view here that the internet proved its durability in the aftermath of the World Trade Center disaster.
I think September 11 was a real testing point for the internet on a couple levels. One was it continued to work when the telephone system didn't. That's how people learned that their loved ones were still alive. Secondly, it showed that the infrastructure is really pretty robust. I mean, it is astounding that we managed to then immediately start trading again on the stock market just 1 week later, and virtually nothing was lost. And that's pretty remarkable.
One of the keynote speakers at this ETRE conference was Michael Dell. He also commented on the durability of the internet.
One of the things we saw in the September 11th crisis is that while the fixed line phone systems went down and the cell phone systems went down, in fact, the way that people were staying in touch was the internet.
On the media side, I think what we learned, it was really the first time that we had a huge media event and the internet didn't completely break. For the first few hours on the 11th, we did have some problems with people getting through to the major MSNBC, CNN sites. But by the next day, when traffic was just as high, the internet was actually working to deliver news. It's interesting, at Newsweek, what we found was that for the first time, we had the correspondents in the field actually filing their reports both to online and to print at the same time. And that's never really happened before.
The internet proved itself in another way in the aftermath of September 11th.
We've also seen that crisis creates some new opportunities. And in fact, the internet is playing a role in helping companies bounce back from some of these challenges more rapidly. One of our customers was in one of those buildings that is unoccupiable. We've got several thousand employees, and they came to us and said, hey, you know what, can you build us several thousand notebooks, ship those to the homes of all of our employees literally within 24 or 48 hours so they can be at home on the internet working online. And that's exactly what we were able to do.
There were many Israeli high-tech companies present here at ETRE, and of course everyone wanted to know how they had learned to cope with doing business in the midst of terrorism.
Israel has found a way practically to deal with living with terrorism, unfortunately, on a daily basis, and yet find a way to be a thriving country and economy, both technologically in medicine, agriculture, and so on. So as far as Israeli companies are concerned, and I helped run one with an R&D center in Netanya, the answer is you keep on working, and people keep on working. They take their kids to school, that the country functions. So it's important not to be so scared that you just don't go to work and you don't get out of bed in the morning. You keep going because life keeps going. So you have to find a way where you practically take certain kinds of safety steps and so forth.
If you look statistically and you take away the emotion, what are the statistics about you personally being involved in a terrorist incident? You could be living in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, you can still measure that. It's very low. And in fact, the impact of terrorism is more on the emotion and the communication of what might happen than the actuality of something that might actually happen. Now that doesn't give anybody more comfort from an emotional standpoint, but from a viewpoint of people getting used to it, of course, life has to go on. It is another factor that increases danger and risk in our lives, and that shakes you emotionally to your core. But ultimately, when it comes time to moving forward about running a company or starting a company or generating revenues or putting food in your mouth or making an income, you have to sort of assess the risk, be comfortable with it, and go forward.
I think the main principle is keeping your focus on the business. I mean, terror is another risk, just like we have accidents, like we have crime, and we have to deal with it. Obviously, you have to be cautious to that. You have to look around. You have to make sure you're seeing what's around you. But beyond that, you should let the law enforcement, the governments deal with it, and you should continue to live your life.
I think human beings by nature we're easily bored. At some point in time, everybody's going to be bored about being down and being depressed, and they're going to say, I'm tired of this, let's go forward. And again, that's where entrepreneurs and leaders in our community and the leader of our country, the president, has to say, I'm tired of this, I'm not going to take it anymore, and now we're ready to move forward.
That's it for part one of our coverage of this year's ETRE conference. For the Computer Chronicles, I'm Stewart Cheifet. Computer Chronicles is brought to you by the Oracle Small Business Suite, one completely integrated application that helps make it easier to run your business, including accounting, sales and service, your web presence, and more. Additional funding is provided by PC to PC, the online migration service from PC First, moving files, applications, and preferences from your old computer to your new one.